Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to talk to you all this morning about something I've been doing research on over the last couple of years at UCL, and that's the numerical modelling of fluid-induced noise over lifting surfaces. So I'll give a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll briefly introduce what fluid-induced noise is and where it occurs, and then the specific focus is how does the flow over a lifting surface produce noise. I'm then going to give you a brief overview of some of the computational methods, and I'm going to try and relate computational acoustics to CFD, and we're going to look at the differences between how we think of traditional fluid flow and also the propagation of acoustic waves. I'm going to have a quick look at some of the different approaches that have been developed for computational aero and hydroacoustics. I'm then going to introduce the method that I've been working on, which is built on a number of previous works, which is called the hybrid LESAPE method. That's LES Large-eddy Simulation, APE is the acoustic perturbation equations. We're going to have a look at an overview of that method and how it's been implemented. So I've implemented it in OpenFOAM. We're then going to have a quick look at a verification and validation study. And then we're going to have a look at a case study, which is trailing edge instability noise, which has been researched for quite a long time, but is still quite notoriously difficult to predict. And there's still a few elements of it that we don't understand. And so I've been applying that model to trying to answer some of those questions. So background and motivation, what is fluid-induced noise? So it's the noise that's produced by the actual fluid dynamics. So I'm not talking here about fluid-induced vibration, although both of those can occur. So I'm talking about the noise that's produced by turbulence and by turbulent fluid flow going over a structure. And within that, we've got lifting surfaces, which are a very important class of flows for producing noise. And I've given some examples of them here. So we've got the hydroplanes on a submarine. We've got aircraft wings. You've got all the flaps and slats here, which all produce quite significant noise, particularly during aircraft landing. We've got offshore wind turbines here, which produce noise. It's considered more of a problem for onshore wind turbines, where they annoy people. But also computer cooling fans. You probably all sat by a computer now and can probably hear a fan. That fundamentally is lifting surface noise. And we've also got a ship propeller here. And you can see these hub vanes on here. And they often act to try and reduce some of the noise as well as improving the efficiency. But all of the surfaces here you can see are lifting surfaces, and all of those produce noise. So how does a lifting surface produce noise? Well, it produces noise from a number of different sources. The first of those is upstream flow, so upstream unsteady or turbulent flow. And when that impinges on a lifting surface, it produces a time-varying pressure field close to the leading edge, and that produces a dipole type noise. If the flow separates at the leading edge, we get periodic vortex shedding, and that produces noise, which tends to be dominated around the frequency of the vortex shedding. Trailing edge noise, which has been researched probably for the best part of a century now, that's caused by the boundary layer being convected over the trailing edge. And at high Reynolds numbers, where you've got a strongly turbulent boundary layer, it's the structures and the spectrum of the turbulent boundary layer that directly matches the spectrum of the radiated noise. Tip vortex noise is particularly important for rotating machinery, and a number of studies have shown that tip vortex noise can be the dominant noise source in marine propellers. And you can also get tip vortex cavitation in hydrodynamic applications. Now again, if the pressure drops below a certain point, this is for hydrodynamic applications, you can get cavitation bubbles forming, and they produce substantial noise primarily produced by the shocks that are induced when the bubbles collapse. And then, as I mentioned, you can also get vortex-induced vibration and turbulence-induced vibration, which is where the time-varying pressure field over the surface causes vibration, which again produces noise. So what computational methods have been developed, and how can we go about computational aeroacoustics? So the study of computational aeroacoustics is about using numerical models to understand the relationship between fluid flow and noise. Now, many of you may be aware that fluid flow and acoustic waves are actually governed by the same system of equations. It's the compressible Navier-Stokes equations. Acoustic waves are fundamentally a fluid flow phenomenon. So the obvious question is, why would you not just run a compressible flow simulation and solve both problems at the same time? A short answer is you can, and some people do try and do this. But, and this is a very big but, particularly for low Mach number flows and particularly for more complex industrial applications. And the fundamental problem is that turbulence and the acoustic waves that are generated by that turbulence behave very differently. The first thing to note is turbulent fluctuations decay very quickly. They tend to only exist over quite short spatial scales, whereas acoustic waves can endure for quite a long time. They're generally very long. It's also the case that the acoustic waves produced by turbulence have an intensity that's often several orders of magnitude smaller than that of the turbulence. So we start to see a very, very large separation of scales. And that's particularly problematic at low Mach numbers, where the acoustic waves tend to be very, very long and have very, very low amplitudes compared to the turbulent scales, which are very small but have very high amplitudes. On a numerical point, compressible solvers tend to work quite badly for low Mach number flows. The equations fundamentally are quite stiff and the solvers exhibit very poor convergence. And finally, in order to get around all of the above problems, the compressible flow simulations that do account for both phenomena in one tend to be extremely expensive. And I've got an example of how this comes about here. So a very well-known Aeolian tone first identified in ancient Greece. And this is the sound produced by the flow over a rod or a wire. So I've got a numerical study here, just a thought exercise more than anything. So if we have a diameter of a centimetre and we have a very low Mach number of 0.01, this would be very typical of a hydrodynamic application. Here we've got a velocity of, say, 15 metres per second. And the sound is produced by the alternating vortex shedding, and the frequency of the vortex shedding is the frequency of the sound. Now these vortices are going to have a length scale that is roughly order of magnitude the same length as the diameter. And we know that the frequency is related to the vortex shedding through the Struhl number, and that Struhl number generally is about 0.2. And for this example, that gives a frequency of 300 Hertz. So now if we know what the speed of sound is, we can work out what the wavelength is going to be, and that's 5 meters. So that means we have a wavelength that is 500 times larger than the rod. So we can see that we have this huge separation of scales between the fluid part and the acoustic part. So what are the options for dealing with this problem? So I've got here a list of some of the popular, well-known computational aeroacoustic methods, roughly in order of decreasing order of computational costs. And the first of those is where we solve both of these together. So we take a scale resolving simulation that accounts for both the hydrodynamic and the acoustic parts. And the mesh and all of the numerical methods must be able to deal with both the turbulent structures that act over a very small scale and the acoustic waves that act over a long scale. Now, the next method down is known as a hybrid method, and that's where we split these two problems into two and we solve them separately. But we solve them both separately in a differential form. So we solve the fluid flow, which we can often solve as an incompressible problem, and then we solve a separate system of equations for the acoustics. Now, probably one of the most common approaches is to use a scale resolving fluid simulation together with an acoustic analogy. Now, this is where we use a scale resolving simulation to compute source terms that then feed into an integral formulation of an acoustic analogy. And many of you may have heard of the curl analogy developed by Curl in 1955. And then the very well-known Fox, Williams and Hawkins model developed in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, these acoustic analogies can also be applied within the context of an unsteady RANS simulation. You have to note here that because you are not resolving any of the turbulent flow field, you're only going to capture the very, very low frequency components. But this can be useful to understand some phenomenon, such as the noise from large-scale vortex shedding over bluff bodies. It's also possible to use a steady state RANS model and then a stochastic simulation that takes information about, say, the boundary layer, such as the turbulent kinetic energy, to try and reconstruct the turbulence spectrum that's then fed into an acoustic analogy. And this has been successfully applied to some cases of trailing edge noise and other phenomena. So my research, as I've already alluded to, has been using the hybrid computational aeroacoustic model, where we split up these two problems into two parts. So as a brief overview, the hybrid method involves solving two systems of PDEs numerically. Now, we can use different domains, meshes, and numerical methods for the two systems, and that allows us to take advantage of the fact that the numerical methods that work very well for the fluid part do not necessarily work that well for the acoustic part, and vice versa. And it also allows us to use different domains to account for these massive separation of scales. So on the right-hand side here, you can see a typical example where we have a foil, so that's our sort of acoustic source, and we have the fluid domain, so we'll resolve the turbulent fluid flow in this small part shown in blue. And then the acoustic waves will be allowed to propagate out into this much larger acoustic domain, which is shown in grey. Now, the code that I've implemented using OpenFOAM can be used with any geometry and also multiple bodies. And it's been implemented to use with unstructured grids to try and allow for more complex industrially relevant cases. And both components run simultaneously and in parallel. So what is the process of doing this? Well, the first process is our part of the process is to run our scale resolving fluid simulation. And that's going to be solved on one domain using one mesh and one set of numerical methods. And this is the fluid simulation. So I use incompressible scale resolving fluid flows, usually through a piso foam. And that's used to determine the source terms for our acoustic equations, which we then map onto our acoustic domain, which is much larger and generally uses a much coarser mesh. And I then solve the acoustic perturbation equations using the finite volume method on our significantly larger domain. So there's a brief overview here of large-eddy simulation, which is the scale resolving simulation technique that I use primarily. For those of you that are familiar with this won't be anything new, but for those of you that are not, large-eddy simulation is a scale resolving technique where we split up the turbulence spectrum into a resolved part and a modeled part. And so the larger scales we resolve, and the effects of the smaller scales, which tend to be the more dissipative, say the more Kolmogorov scales, they will be modeled using a subgrid scale model. And the subgrid scale model is analogous to a RANS turbulence model. A large-eddy simulation is a lot cheaper than direct numerical simulation, but generally speaking, it is significantly more expensive than a RANS simulation. So you'll notice on the right-hand side here, I've just got the usual, the standard equations. So you've got the continuity equation for an incompressible flow, and then the momentum equations. And then this is your subgrid scale component on the right-hand side. Again, this is analogous to the Reynolds stress component that you see in a RANS model. And then I've just got a typical image of a large-eddy simulation. Below, this is turbulent vortex shedding by a cylinder and impinging on a wing. And you can see the turbulent structures here that are demonstrated using the Q criteria. Let's go into a little bit more detail of what large-eddy simulation does. On the top left here, you got in the black line is a typical turbulent velocity profile, which is the black line, and you can see it's made up of a number of different scales. And then we've got this filtered velocity profile, which is filtering out the smaller scales. And so this red line would represent the scales and the velocity fluctuations that we would seek to resolve. And then we subtract out of that what we call these sub-filter scale fluctuations. And it's filter scale fluctuations that we would model using a subgrid scale model. Showing that in wave number space, you can see that it's the larger scales, the larger length scales here, higher energy containing scales that we resolve. And then it's the smaller scales that are modeled by a sub-filter scale model. And we generally use the mesh resolution to determine which scales are resolved and which scales are modeled. So we use that to compute our source terms, which we then need to map onto a separate grid. And I do that using something called local radial basis function interpolation. So the process by which this is done is we take an acoustic cell here, and we find the fluid cell that acoustic cell location is in, and then we construct a point cloud, sometimes referred to as a support cloud, and we'll use that to construct radial basis functions that allow us to interpolate from the fluid grid to the acoustic grid. And this has been found to be quite an efficient and very accurate method. It's certainly a lot more accurate than things like inverse distance weighted and least squares methods. So once we've then mapped our source terms over, we use the acoustic perturbation equations, which are shown here, and they're used to model the wave propagation of the acoustic waves through a flowing medium. Now, the source terms that we've computed are just the total derivative of the incompressible field, and they're shown here. And that's quite useful because they're very easy to compute. That's computed just using information we have from our fluid simulation. Now, with the acoustic perturbation equations, we can account for much more complex phenomenon than we can with a boundary integral method, for example, because we can account for some of the volumetric features that may exist in for the propagation, such as reflection, absorption, diffraction, which makes this method a lot more flexible and applicable to a broader class of problems. Now, the fluxes, so the discretization approach I use is based on a second order Riemann solver, so it's just linear reconstruction of the faces. And one of the main benefits of this is it's strongly conservative, which is important because we're dealing with hyperbolic equations. It prevents dispersion errors, so it keeps track of all of the wave speed information. And I've implemented this using a semi-discrete formulation with a third order Runge-Kutta method for the time integration. So a brief overview of how this has been implemented within OpenFOAM. So we have the PISO algorithm first, where we solve for the turbulent fields and the pressure and velocity. We then compute the source terms, map them onto our acoustic domain. We then run the acoustic solver, solving for the acoustic variables. And generally, due to the speed of the acoustic problem, we generally have to solve the acoustic problem for more time steps than the fluid solver. And then we run back through. So we cycle this back round using these multiple loops. And both of these problems are solved simultaneously. So a brief verification study. So again, we're going to go back to our cylinder. So low Reynolds number. So we've got laminar vortex shedding. And we know what this should look like. We know it should produce this dipole acoustic signature where the frequency should match that of the vortex shedding. And we've got a video here of this working. So on the left-hand side, you've got our fluid domain. And you can see the periodic vortex shedding starting up. And then at some time, the acoustic simulation then starts up on the right-hand side. And you can see the waves propagating away from the cylinder. Now, due to the separation of scales here, the cylinder looks quite big here, whereas it's very, very small here because the acoustic domain is significantly larger. But I use something called a perfectly matched layer at the far field boundary, and that helps to damp the solution towards the far field boundaries, preventing any reflections. So this shows this nice relationship between the fluid flow and the acoustic field. And that's one of the really nice things about these hybrid methods is you get a huge amount of visual information that helps you to understand the underlying physics. So moving on to a case study, I wanted to just share with you some work I've been doing recently on trailing edge instability noise. Now, this occurs over quite a wide range of applications, generally at moderate Reynolds numbers, and it's been shown to occur in small wind turbines. It's quite common in gliders and also in some unmanned aerial and unmanned underwater vehicles. And it can also occur in some small rotating machinery components, such as cooling fans. It's associated with something called a Tolman-Schlichting instability wave. Now, that's the wave that's responsible for the transition of the boundary layer, which is why it only generally occurs at moderate Reynolds numbers. So it's where the boundary layer is still transitional, hence why it's referred to as instability noise. And under certain circumstances, this can result in very strongly amplified tonal noise if certain conditions are met. And a series of studies over the past 20 years or so have highlighted that the boundary layer must be transitional on one side, so we must have these TS waves. And we need a small separated region on the transitional side, and that is what's responsible for this amplification. And I've stolen an image from Nash's paper from '99, where they show quite a nice diagram of how this comes about. So you get the transition here we're talking about on the pressure side, where you get this region of linear growth followed by this strong amplification, and then these strongly amplified TS waves are then radiated as sound waves at the trailing edge. So I've looked at two Reynolds numbers. Again, you can see they're both moderate Reynolds numbers, and I've used a NACA 0012 foil. So I'm comparing with some experimental data where experiments were carried out at 0 degrees, but the experimental study noted some asymmetry, and so I've run my simulations at 0 degrees and 1 degree to try and understand this. And so some rough parameters: the fluid mesh is 72 million cells, and the acoustic mesh is much coarser but much larger, but that only needs 25 million. So you can see here we've got the flow field here, we've got the turbulent structures here. You can see the boundary layer becoming transitional, and you've got these strongly span-wise coherent structures, and that's leading to this characteristic dipole trailing edge noise. And then again, at a slightly higher Reynolds number, you can see the transition starts slightly further upstream, but it again leads to this strongly coherent flow, leading to this higher frequency dipole noise. So comparing with the experimental results, we've generally got reasonably good agreement, although the peak frequency tends to be slightly over-predicted. Still trying to work out exactly why that is. Increasing the angle to 1 degree does tend to improve the results. You can see we get quite good agreement between the experiments and the 1 degree case at the lower Reynolds number. Slightly less good agreement at 128,000. But you're generally seeing quite good agreement, and for acoustic simulations of this type, this is considered quite good agreement. So we can see that between 0 degrees and 1 degree, we have this spectral broadening, where at 0 degrees, particularly here, you can see this very dominant single component, so one frequency. And then as we increase to 1 degree, we get a slight broadening. And we actually, for this case, actually see a slight increase in the sound, the overall sound pressure level. So that leads us to ask what happens if we increase this angle further. So we've got a separate set of simulations here where I varied the angle of attack. When we start out at 0 degrees to 1 degree, we see very little change. Moving to 2 degrees, we see a slight decrease, but not that much. And then 3 degrees, we see a slight decrease further. Then moving to 4 degrees, we see a very dramatic change of almost 20 decibels, which in acoustic terms is a significant drop. So between 3 degrees and 4 degrees, so only a very, very slight change in operating conditions, we see a very, very sharp drop in the acoustic intensity. And then moving out further, we see a trough, and then it starts to increase again as we move to 8 degrees. So we've got a very non-linear relationship between the airfoil loading and the overall sound pressure level. And we've sort of asked, immediately, what's happening here? Why is this happening? And what we see is that as the angle increases, we start to see separation on the suction side. And that brings forward the transition point due to the adverse pressure gradient. And what that does is it allows for three-dimensional instabilities to start to creep in. So as well as the TS wave causing the initial transition of the boundary layer, we start to get these three-dimensional instabilities, and they reduce the span-wise coherence, which reduces the acoustic efficiency. If we then move to 4 degrees, what actually happens is we get an abrupt change in the transition mechanism. And what happens is at about 50% of the chord, so about halfway along the foil, we get a laminar separation bubble forming, and this causes a switch in the transition mechanism, where we now get a Kelvin-Helmholtz transition mechanism, which is much faster. And that leads to the boundary layer being fully turbulent at the trailing edge. Then as we increase the angle further, we start to get flow separation, and that starts to increase the sound pressure level, but due to a different mechanism. So if we look at that in terms of what the flow field looks like, here we've got the ISO-Q contours, which is a good way of visualizing the turbulent structures. And we can see at 1 degree, we have these very strong span-wise coherence of these tubular vortices. And these result in very efficient acoustic waves being transmitted. So everything is in phase, dominated by this single frequency component. In this case, it's about 700 hertz. As we move to 2 degrees, we can see that the transition mechanism has moved slightly further upstream. And this is allowing for some of these 3-dimensional instabilities to creep in. And so we're seeing a drop in the peak sound pressure, but we're seeing a spectral broadening. As we then move to 4 degrees, you notice the sound pressure level drops across the board. And what's happening is the transition mechanism here is switching, and we can see that if we compare to the previous case where the transition mechanism takes place over a very long range, this is a TS transition mechanism. The Kelvin-Helmholtz transition mechanism, the whole process takes place over this very, very short period of time. And that leads to this very turbulent, incoherent boundary layer at the trailing edge, which is a very inefficient acoustic emitter. Finally, moving to 8 degrees, we can see the separation is now quite close to the leading edge. And we're starting now to see flow separation here with some more periodic vortex shedding. And then you start to see this component starting to rise. And this is associated with the periodic vortex shedding at the leading edge. And then as you increase the angle further, this component starts to increase, but it never goes back to the same level that you saw back here, where you have these very strongly amplified tones. So what have we learned? Well, the first thing we've learned now is that the acoustic intensity drops enormously once the boundary layer becomes fully turbulent. And this echoes the work of a previous study from a few years ago by Michel Roger down in Lyon, who showed that attached turbulent boundary layers produce very little noise compared to transitional ones. And that's echoed here. And a high amplitude trailing edge noise occurs when the energy is very concentrated over a narrow band and when the flow structures are coherent. So we see this very close relationship between the spectral content of the boundary layer and the dynamics of the far field acoustics. And this then gives us some indications of how we might reduce this type of noise. We can immediately see that the biggest problem with the noise is if everything is coherent. So we immediately think, well, that means we need to decorrelate the flow. We need to disrupt the flow, introduce those 3-dimensional instabilities earlier in order to prevent the flow being coherent near the trailing edge. And some recent modifications to try and reduce span-wise coherence, such as serrated trailing edges, and also mechanisms using porous trailing edges that try and do this, and they've been shown to be quite effective. The important lesson here that I want to get across is that these hybrid models really allow you to really understand the relationship between the flow physics and the resulting acoustics. So just to conclude, I've presented a hybrid computational code that's been developed and validated. And it's worth pointing out that there's a lot less collective experience of using these models compared with normal CFD. But this is growing and the models are becoming quite a lot better. They're becoming more sophisticated and they're becoming a lot more robust. I've used this model to investigate trailing edge noise, and that's shown this important relationship between the dynamics of the boundary layer and the trailing edge noise. And it's also shown that the noise is extremely sensitive to quite small changes in the operating conditions. And further studies I'm looking at now are looking at more complex cases such as multi-body interaction noise, and also finite span foils to look at tip vortex noise and the influence of tip vortex noise on trailing edge flows. So thank you all for listening. Probably got time for some questions, have we, Dan?